Good afternoon, everybody. We are doing something a little bit different today for our video. We are going to be creating a tier list for the Georgia snakes. So for this list, I have a couple of stipulations that I've put in just so that we can rank these snakes as accurately and as fairly as possible, even though this is going to be completely based on my opinion. The first of these being, I am not including all subspecies. I'm only including subspecies that I think are relevant to the rank and subspecies that I think are significantly different enough to the point where it would affect the ranking of the animal. I'm also not including subspecies that have a very broad intergrade zone in Georgia. For example, I'm not including ringneck or racer subspecies because the better part of the state is a giant intergrade zone. But I am including Eastern Kings and Eastern Black Kings, even though they are only different at a subspecies level. I think they're significantly different in the field, and it's definitely worth having a separate ranking for each of those. So yeah, I was just mostly using this as something fun to do while we're waiting for warmer weather to come, and I also think it would be a pretty interesting video, so you guys can see where I stand on exactly what is my favorite snake and what I rank the highest, what I rank the lowest. And it's not going to be easy to do because even the most common and the most boring snakes in Georgia, I think, are still very fascinating animals. So it's going to really suck to have to put some of these guys down there in F tier, but I think I'm going to have to do it just because it's going to be hard to leave that tier open, especially considering how big of a gap there is between the coolest snakes in Georgia and the least cool, in my opinion. So like I said, this is all for good fun. It's all my opinion. And feel free to let me know if you disagree in the comments. Alright guys, so before we get started, here's a look at all the snakes we have. They're organized not by their rank, but by what type of snake they are. For example, we've got the fossorial snakes here first, and then we kind of move into the nature scenes and aquatic snakes, and then to the rat snakes and the bigger terrestrial snakes like king snakes, hog noses, pine snakes, and then we're going to finish up with our venomous snakes here at the bottom. So without further ado, let's get to ranking these snakes by tier. First up, we have the eastern worm snake, or just the worm snake in general. I'm going to move them up here to C for now. These snakes are quite common. There isn't too much to say about them, so I can't rank them too much higher than C or D. But I think these snakes are going to probably fall pretty comfortably into D tier. They're very common, they're very small, and rather unremarkable compared to a lot of the other snakes in this list, as awesome as they may be. So we're going to put those guys in D for now. We might make a few adjustments later once we see what the final spread is looking like. But for now, I think D is a pretty good place to put those guys. Next up, we have the brown snake, Sterarea decii. These guys are another widespread, super common species, but I do like brown snakes a little bit more just because they can be variable. And you do actually get to see brown snakes active on the surface fairly often, unlike with worm snakes where you only see them when you're flipping. But nevertheless, one of the more common snakes we have in Georgia. I would rank them a little bit higher than worm snakes just because they're more variable, but I don't think we could justify putting them in C tier. Up next, we have the red-bellied snakes. I did include the Florida red-bellied snake, which is going to be this more vibrantly colored guy. I do think these are a little bit more colorful on average, and they're definitely a little bit rarer because they live only in extreme South Georgia. You only really get these guys in the coastal plain where there's not as much red-bellied snake habitat. So they are a little bit more uncommon than the northern red-bellies, but I think it's pretty easy to put both these guys in D tier with a lot of the other fossorials. Next up, we have the Tantilla. We've only got two Tantilla here in Georgia, the Southeastern crown snake and the Florida crown snake. I think the Southeastern crown snake is a really cool snake. I love Tantilla, and because of that, I think we could probably move them up to C tier. They're a little bit more uncommon, a little bit more difficult to find than a lot of these other fossorials, and they're definitely a little bit more restricted in range. And from that, we get to the Florida crown snake, which is kind of an interesting one because these guys are actually one of the more uncommon snakes in Georgia. And because of that rarity alone, I think we could definitely put them in front of the Southeastern crown snake in tier. But I think it would be a little bit ridiculous to move these guys any higher than C just because they likely are pretty common where they occur, but they only come into Georgia in a few counties. This photo here is actually one that I took only a few miles from the Georgia border in North Florida. And once again, I don't think these would be a rare snake if we actually spent any time in their habitat in Georgia. But it's so far and so obscure that I just haven't really looked for these guys at all within the state. Now we get to a kind of interesting group of snakes. If there was a snake to put in F tier, it's the earth snakes. We know them, we love them. Rough earth snakes are actually one of the more uncommon fossorial snakes in Georgia, but they're just so nondescript. They're just painfully nondescript. Both rough and smooth earth snakes really have nothing going for them appearance-wise. In the grand scheme of things, they're probably the smallest and dullest snake we have, which is really unfortunate that we'd have to put these two guys in F tier. But like I said, if there was a snake to put in F tier, it's the earth snakes. That being said, rough earth snakes are quite rare in a lot of Georgia, so I would put them in front of smooth earths, even though I think smooth earths are a little bit prettier. Rough earth snakes definitely get a rarity boost in this department, so we're going to put those guys both in F tier. It'd be kind of hard to rank either of them higher than the other because they're so similar. But yeah, sorry about that, earth snake fans. If there's anybody out there who's just obsessed with earth snakes, I hate to say it, but these guys are going to have to go in F tier in my list. Even though I love them to death, I would die for them. I just can't think of another snake that would fit in F tier better than these very small, nondescript, and rather common snakes. You could potentially split hairs here and rank northern ringnecks and southern ringnecks differently because northerns are a little bit bigger. This guy in the photo is actually my favorite ringneck I've found in Georgia. He had this really cool two-tone look to him, but that's a story for another video. So I think we're just going to put ringnecks in D tier. They're one of the most common, if not the most common snakes in the state, but they are quite colorful. And they're always nice to look at, always nice to see, especially when you find interesting ones like this guy with the two-tone look to him. All right, now we're kind of getting into two of the more interesting fossorial snakes we have in Georgia. The northern scarlet snake, I think, is a pretty strong candidate for B or even potentially A tier. The more I think about it, the more I think that this snake could go in A tier just because they're so pretty. But they are incredibly common in a lot of South Georgia. You can find them on the road at night and a lot of the southern half of the state pretty commonly. And even in the northern half of the state where they're a better find, they are still a relatively common snake. So I don't think we're going to be able to move these guys too much higher than B, but I do love scarlet snakes a lot. They're one of my favorite quote-unquote common species to see. Next up, we have the Pinewoods snake. This is a pretty obscure little snake that I have not seen too many of in Georgia. The ones I have seen have been in shed and not the best looking. This photo is from North Florida. I don't think there's much of a difference in how the snakes appear in Georgia and Florida, but I do think they're pretty interesting, and their restricted range on the coast of Georgia makes them kind of hard to find within the state. I do think C tier is a pretty comfortable place to put this guy, alongside the other more uncommon and restricted in range fossorial species. One cool thing that could be said about this genus is that they're largely tropical. There's a lot of diversity in the Rhadinaea genus in Central and South America, and these guys are the northernmost representative of that genus, coming all the way up. I think they go all the way into North Carolina on the coast. All right, we're starting to get into the nature scenes here. First up, we've got the eastern garter snake. I think these are a pretty well-rounded snake. I'll put them in C tier for now. They are quite variable, and you get a lot of cool variation across the state. This one was from the Piedmont, but a lot of the coastal plains populations can turn reddish or bluish. Just a really variable, solid snake. I don't really understand people who don't like garter snakes. I think they're one of the more interesting common snakes. They're really easy to observe, accessible for a lot of people. And I think that makes them pretty special just because of how common they are and how variable they are. This is a lot of people's first snake they find in the wild. All right, let's go ahead and rank these ribbons since they're in the same genus as the garter. We got the Peninsular Ribbon. I think these guys are probably going to have a hard time getting above D tier. They're not quite as pretty as garter snakes, and I think they're definitely the least attractive of our Georgia Thamnophis, even though this one in the photo is a really pretty individual. I think that's a South Georgia snake. I can't remember exactly where I took that photo, but this is the Peninsular Ribbon snake. This species is pretty much only found in the lower coastal plain of Georgia, and then you get the slightly more attractive, in my opinion, eastern ribbon snakes. I would put these guys up here in C tier with the garters. They're a pretty solid snake. I think they're a lot more attractive than the Peninsular Ribbon snakes on average, and I also definitely think that you could probably rank them even higher than garters just because they are quite rare in the northern half of the state. All right, so now we're getting into our Nerodia. I ended up breaking the common water snake into three. The first of which is going to be the northern water snake, which we only really get in the Blue Ridge of Georgia. That makes them kind of uncommon just based on how many counties you can find them in. It's pretty limited, but they are incredibly abundant when you're in the right habitat. And then we have the Midland water snake, which in Georgia It's pretty often a really striking snake like this one I included here, but this is not an unusual look for most of the Georgia Piedmont Midland water snakes. They get some striking coloration on them, and I think for most states, it would be hard to rank them significantly above the northern water snakes and the banded water snakes, but I think in Georgia, these guys get a pretty solid spot in C tier. They're big, variable. They're really fun to look for and catch, and they're also one of those snakes that you can observe over the course of the year and often see the same individual in the same place, which is really cool to me. Next up, we have the banded water snake, which I think is probably going to end up going in D tier. These guys definitely can be as pretty as Midland water snakes, but from my experience in Georgia, the bandeds are generally a pretty dull, drab coloration overall. But they are quite variable like a lot of water snakes. This is one of the more interesting ones I've seen, I guess, where it's almost kind of tiger striped rather than banded. And this phenotype is pretty common in South Georgia. So I think it's a decent representation of banded water snakes in the state. And once again, this is another incredibly common snake. You can see dozens of these in the same night in South Georgia. So they're not going to get many points in the rarity department, but they are a fairly large snake that's fun and interesting to look for. So I'd have a hard time putting these guys any lower than D tier, but I'd also have a hard time putting them much higher. All right, now we start getting into some of the more obscure water snakes. The Florida green water snake, I think, is a pretty good candidate for C tier. They're one of the larger water snakes, and also, I have not seen this species in Georgia yet. I don't spend a lot of time in range of these guys. These are a pretty rare snake in the state of Georgia. Where they occur, they can be locally common, but getting into that habitat is a bit of a pain. So just because of the rarity factor alone, I'd say these guys belong in at least C tier, and you could definitely make an argument that they're one of the cooler Nerodia. Next up, we have brown water snakes. In terms of size and shape, they are quite similar to the green waters, but they're a lot more common. However, I do really like these water snakes. I think they're definitely one of the better water snakes we have. Oftentimes, they're pretty mild-mannered, and they get gigantic. I'm not sure there's another Nerodia species that I've seen honest 5-footers of, but I have seen some very big, around the 5-foot mark, brown water snakes in Georgia. Next up, we get to what I would say is my favorite Nerodia, the plain-bellied water snake. In Georgia, we only really get the red-bellied variant, which they have this really cool olive coloration with a very, very bright red belly. I think that this species belongs in B. They are my favorite Nerodia in the state. They get really big, and they can be incredibly beautiful when they're freshly shed and not covered in mud. That being said, they do have quite an attitude, and if you're taking temperament into account, you probably couldn't put them in B, because if you pick up these snakes, you are going to get bit. Next up, we have the queen snake. I think these guys are a pretty strong candidate for C tier. They're a solid snake all around, but they're pretty common. And aside from their interesting choice of diet, there isn't too much to say about these guys. However, I do think queen snakes are probably my favorite representatives of the crayfish snake group, just because you can actually find them during the daytime, and you can find them in habitat pretty easily, and I have not had any success with the other crayfish snakes in terms of finding them off of roadways and in habitat. So next up, we have the striped crayfish snake. I think these guys definitely could potentially go higher than C or D, but I think they're a pretty comfortable placement for C tier. They're not super common in the state of Georgia. They're another one of those snakes that has that kind of restricted range, and we don't know too much about them, so it's possible they have a more extensive range in Georgia than we think. But for the most part, these are a pretty uncommon snake in Georgia, and I've never seen one in the state. We're definitely going to have to put these guys at least C tier just because they can be a pain to find, and I don't think there's really too much reason to rank them any lower or higher than queen snakes. And because of that, we're also going to go ahead and throw the glossy crayfish snake, which is the more common of the South Georgia crayfish snakes, in here too. I have seen quite a few of these. They're definitely more common than striped crayfish snakes in Georgia. But once again, I don't think I could rank them any higher than the other crayfish snakes, so we're going to leave them in C2. Next up, we have the black swamp snake. This is a snake that definitely belongs a little bit higher than the other aquatics, in my opinion. They have an incredibly beautiful bright red belly, and they can be a royal pain to find in the state of Georgia. This is another species I have not seen in the state that only really lives in these nice open wetlands with lots of weedy vegetation. And they have a really interesting distribution too, in that they're found not only in that southern portion, but also along the Savannah River. These guys kind of have an interesting distribution, and they're definitely beautiful. This is a black swamp snake that I found in Florida. I have not found many individuals anywhere near Georgia, and the ones that I have been really tiny and uncooperative, so I included this photo just because it's a better representation of how cool this species can be. And I think B tier is a pretty good place to put them. They're small, so they're not quite as big and impressive as our next snakes. Next up, we have Farancia, the rainbow and mud snakes. So it's going to be really hard to rank a mud snake anywhere lower than A tier. As common as these guys can be in the coastal plain, their rarity and mystique in northern Georgia makes me put these snakes firmly in A tier. Overall, mud snakes are pretty hard to find. They're huge, strikingly colored snakes that feed on giant salamanders. There's not really anything not to love about mud snakes, so they're a strong competitor in A tier, and I think it would be pretty easy to push them up into S2. Next, we have the closely related rainbow snakes. These are also another strong candidate for A tier. Personally, I prefer mud snakes. I think they're a little bit cooler and more interesting. And honestly, I've had a harder time finding mud snakes. Most of the places that do have rainbow snakes, they tend to be fairly common if you can get out there in the right time of year, which you could probably say the same thing about mud snakes too. There's no denying that they're incredibly beautiful, and they're some of my favorite snakes to look for, so I think these guys both deserve an A tier seat. This is our first A tier ranking that we've had so far. Alright, now we're getting into the colubrids, which are one of my favorite groups in the state. First up, we got the rough green snake. I think these guys are a pretty good candidate for C or maybe even B tier. You know what? I definitely think these are a B tier snake. They are definitely unique among Georgia snakes. There's nothing else here that is long and green and lives in trees eating bugs. They're just a super weird snake. They stand out amongst the local fauna, and I think it's going to be pretty hard to rank these guys any lower than B. When I first got into snakes, these were one of the snakes that I obsessed over, and I finally figured out how to find them, and those memories are some of my best childhood memories of looking for snakes. We're going to put these guys in B. Next up, we have rat snakes. So I've included 3 different rat snakes for the state of Georgia. We've got the classic black rat, the yellow rat, and then the gray rat. So in Georgia, our yellow rat snakes are kind of dingy from my experience. I think these guys are probably a pretty solid snake in C tier. If they were prettier, or if I was able to find prettier ones, I might move them up to B. But from my experience, you kind of get these dull, intergrady looking yellow rats. You don't get the crazy looking, bright yellow striped ones like you see in Florida. But they are a big, impressive snake, and I think C tier is a pretty good place to put them. Next up, we have the black rat snake. I think these guys could probably be ranked above yellow rats. I think putting them in B tier isn't a stretch. And I think gray rat snakes go right there alongside them. There's a large zone of integration between the gray and black rat snakes in Georgia, so more often than not, you're finding something in between the two, and I think those snakes pretty much fall into B tier. I like gray rats a lot, I like black rats a lot, and I like the intergrades that we get. Once again, any of these bigger colubrids, I think it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to move the yellow rats up into B tier either, but because we are in Georgia and our yellow rats don't tend to be the best from my experience, I will move them down to C and leave black rats and gray rats in B. Next up, corn snakes. I mean, who doesn't love corn snakes? But definitely, at the very least, B tier snakes, and I think it wouldn't be a stretch at all to move these snakes up into A tier. Another interesting thing about corn snakes is we have pretty different look in the northern half of the state from the southern half of the state. This particular individual is from a mountaintop in northwest Georgia. So we do get vibrant looking corns throughout the state. And honestly, these ones with the orange and gray, rather than just the bright orange, tend to be my favorites. So next up, we've got racers and coach whips. Black racers, I think it would be kind of disrespectful to put them any lower than C. They're a very average snake. They're your quintessential large diurnal black snake. It always makes a slow day feel more exciting, even if you're just finding racers. So, solid snake all around. I think C tier is a pretty comfortable place to put these guys. Now we get into the coach whip. Now this is going to be a pretty controversial decision, but these are some of my favorite snakes, and I think it's nothing short of disrespectful to put coach whips lower than S tier. One thing that could definitely be said about coach whips is that they're not all created equal. There's some very nice coach whips, and then there's some very coach whips. But I think all around, these are huge, impressive snakes that don't get enough respect, in my opinion. And they're definitely one of my favorite snakes to look for, one of my favorite snakes to catch. And on top of that, who doesn't love just a perfect transition from this black coloration on the head to that stark tan coloration on the tail? This particular coach whip that's sitting here in S tier, when I captured it, it regurgitated a pine snake. So this coach whip had killed and eaten a pine snake. And anything that kills and eats pine snakes deserves to go right up there in S tier. And on top of that, these snakes are incredibly rare in the northern half of Georgia and are some of the hardest snakes to find in the region that I live. But I also genuinely do believe they belong there. So if this was a traditional tier list that was made based on who would eat who, coach whips would also be an S tier because they're gigantic and they'll eat just about anything they can catch. Like I said earlier, this one in the photo had eaten a pine snake, and that is absurd. All right, we're getting into the meat of this list now. We've got pretty much only the Lampropeltis, Hog Noses, pine snakes, indigos, and the venomous snakes remaining. Let's go ahead and dive into Lampropeltis. First up, we have the Eastern milk snake. I think these snakes are a pretty strong candidate for B tier. If we were taking the best milk snakes, I would definitely put them into A or S. Next up, we have their more colorful relatives, the Scarlet king snakes. And I think these guys have a pretty strong spot in the A tier, in my opinion. The only thing that they don't have going for them is that they are quite common in half of the state. They are also pretty small. And obviously, they're striking, they're beautiful, really good-looking snakes. So we're going to go with Scarlet king snake in A tier. Now we have the Eastern king. If anybody watching this video knows me at all, you already know where this snake is going. And he's going all the way up top, right next to the coach whip. Eastern kings are a strong candidate for my favorite snake in the world. And I think they're the quintessential snake. They're perfect in every way. They're big, they're strikingly colored, they're intelligent, they're secretive, and they can be a real pain to look for. And all of those things combined make them, in my opinion, one of the best well-rounded snakes. They're not so incredibly difficult to find that it's frustrating, but they're also difficult enough that it isn't necessarily easy. They live in a variety of habitats, which I think is particularly interesting because I get to go to different places when I'm looking for them rather than just the same type of habitat over and over again. And that gets bonus points as well. And on top of that, looking for them is an absolute blast because a lot of the time you're dealing with flipping and hiking in habitat rather than road cruising, which is always good for me because I am not a fan of driving in circles and not finding anything. That being said, you will occasionally find a king snake on the road, and that's always a pleasant surprise. But yeah, S tier, easy. Next up, we have the black king snake. This is not a Georgia representative of the black king snake, but I figured it was definitely important to distinguish between the two. I think black king snakes could probably go in A tier for me. This one would definitely go in A tier, but this isn't a Georgia representative because I didn't have any photos of really pretty Georgia black kings. It seems like, and I didn't realize this until I was going through my photos, but it seems like every time I find a true black king in Georgia, they're either in shed or they're beat up. They're just not the best looking. And it's not because there aren't nice ones here. It's just bad luck on my part. I think of black kings and milk snakes kind of going hand in hand. You find them together in the same places. If you're finding milk snakes, typically you're finding black kings and not easterns. But yeah, I think they belong here in B tier alongside a bunch of other respectable snakes. But at the same time, these are some of my favorite snakes in the B tier. And just because they're not making it up into A doesn't mean they don't deserve it. I just think when you compare them to the snakes we have in A tier, that there's a line to be drawn there. So now we move on to the mole king. Now, mole kings are kind of interesting because I don't think they're the most attractive looking snakes, but they're certainly interesting to look for. And if we were going on appearance alone, I probably wouldn't move them too much higher than B. But because these snakes can be such a pain to find, and I do have a soft spot for them, I would put mole king snakes in A tier. They're one of the tougher snakes to find, and they're definitely one of the more enigmatic. I never really have any idea whether or not I'm going to find a mole king snake on any given day. They like open areas with loose soil, and anytime you're in that habitat, you could potentially stumble across a mole king, but a lot of times it requires a lot of brutal road cruising and a lot of know-how to turn up one of these snakes in Georgia. That being said, I definitely wouldn't put them quite as high as Eastern kings, and I really wouldn't put them as high as Scarlet kings either. So I'd say this is probably a pretty low A-tier entry, but definitely an A-tier snake in my opinion. All right, next up we have the Eastern Hognose. I think there's a pretty solid case to put this snake in S tier, but like I said, we're trying to keep our S tier kind of limited, so this is a pretty good candidate for A. I do think Eastern Hognoses belong alongside Coach Whips and Eastern Kings, and that they're very well-rounded snakes. There's not much that can be said about these snakes that isn't interesting. They have a very cool appearance. They're super variable. They have a specialized diet, which is cool, and they live in some really interesting places in the state of Georgia. However, They can be quite common, and I don't feel like they quite belong up here in S tier with these other snakes. But at the same time, they're definitely one of the better snakes in the state of Georgia, and I would say that they're teetering between A and S tier. Because next up we have the Southern Hognose, which is not as cool as the Eastern Hognose in my opinion, and I think they're a pretty strong candidate for B tier. They're really great snakes, but they are incredibly common in the right habitats, particularly in the state of Georgia. They're also not as variable as Eastern Hognoses. You can find really only 2 phases of Southern Hogs. You get this kind of typical one like I have here, and then you'll get them with a little bit more red on them. But you don't see the spectrum that you do with Eastern Hognoses, where you can go from solid black like this guy to just the most incredible red coloration on this entire page, which is definitely possible within Eastern Hognoses. Some of the nicest snakes I've ever seen pictures of are colorful Eastern Hognoses. And in my opinion, that puts them a whole tier above their southern cousins. Alright, now we're getting into the pine snakes. As you see, I have 2 pine snakes here, and this is a very important distinction because these are not the same snakes for many reasons. First of all, being Florida pine snakes have a pretty extensive range in Georgia, and I love them to death. These snakes fall very easily into A tier, and they can still be one of the most difficult snakes to find in the state of Georgia, even though they are leagues more common than the northern pine. And on top of that, they're pretty variable as well, but the ones in Georgia tend to be a little bit more dull than the ones in Florida. And the intergrade Florida pine snakes are the best looking ones in the state from my experience. And I wanted to include a pure Florida pine for this picture, so this is a deep South Georgia individual. Some of the snakes you find in central Georgia are much more striking in my opinion, but I didn't think they would be a good representative of the Florida subspecies because they do have a lot of northern influence in my opinion. And that brings us to the northern pine snake, this is the only photo in here I did not take. This was taken by my buddy Zach, and I'll include his Flickr link in the description if you want to look at more of his photos. But these are my favorite snake in the state. They're the rarest snake in the state of Georgia, and I don't think that's really in question. They live pretty much exclusively in the highest risk portion of the state, which is the Piedmont and the northern, basically, quarter of the state, which at this point in time is also the most heavily developed. So the habitat for the northern pine snake is not only disappearing at a rate much faster than anything else on this tier list, they're also just incredible. Like, look at this yellow snake. This is a fresh hatchling. They hatch out at a titanic size, over a foot long in some cases. And they have earned the nickname the Phantom of the Forest because of just how difficult it can be to detect these snakes. This is the last species of snake on this list that I have not seen in the wild, even though there are a couple on here that I haven't seen within the state of Georgia yet. I have yet to find a pure northern pine snake anywhere else, and it's not really for lack of trying. I've looked in Alabama, I've looked in Tennessee. Now, northern pine snakes can get quite common in the coastal plain of some of the Atlantic states, like North Carolina and New Jersey, but they're still a very impressive snake no matter where you find them. And the ones in Georgia tend to have this kind of yellowish coloration, which I prefer to the black and white ones that you get along the Atlantic coast. But either way, this is the top of the top, in my opinion. It just doesn't get any rarer, it doesn't get any cooler, it doesn't get any more attractive than the northern pine snake in the state of Georgia. So that is going to be the top spot on this list, even though we still have a few more to rank. Next up, we have the Eastern Indigo snake. These are an iconic serpent of the coastal plain here in Georgia, and I think it would be pretty disrespectful to put them anywhere other than A tier. But they definitely are one of the most threatened species we have. I think they're the only snake on this list that is on the federal endangered species list. They're listed as threatened, if I remember correctly. And that's another thing that prevents me from putting them up here in S tier, because these snakes are actually protected to the degree that you can't mess with them. You don't want to go looking for these snakes. You can get in trouble for it. So unless you're a permitted scientist, these are not really a snake that you can go mess with. However, they are gigantic, they are beautiful. If you ever have an opportunity to spend some time in the habitat of these snakes, I would highly recommend it. And I would also highly recommend joining some of the conservation organizations, such as the Orianne Society, that work very hard to protect these snakes. Alright, now we're getting into the venomous snakes. We've got the Cottonmouths coming up first. I've included 3 different Cottonmouths here because I do think there are 3 pretty distinct types of Cottonmouths you get in the state of Georgia, even if the genetic science that we're going through right now doesn't support that. From a phenotypical standpoint, there are 3 very distinct phenotypes you see in the state of Georgia, And the first is the Eastern Cottonmouth, kind of this more colorful classic Cottonmouth. I think these snakes are a pretty easy entry into B or C tier. They can be incredibly beautiful, but a lot of times this is actually one of the more common snakes in their range. It's not uncommon to see, a dozen of these within a few feet of each other in some places in the eastern half of the state of Georgia. But this kind of eastern phenotype of the Cottonmouth is largely, you see it along the coast and then along the border of South Carolina. This particular picture was taken right on the border of South Carolina. Next up, we have this kind of northern Cottonmouth look that looks more like what was formerly known as the western Cottonmouth. This is what the snakes in northwest Georgia tend to look like. Some of the snakes in the metro Atlanta area will be this darker color. These are my favorite Cottonmouths in the state. I think they are quite a bit prettier than the eastern Cottonmouths and the Florida Cottonmouth. Hardly even looks like a Cottonmouth. They're incredible looking. Some of the ones that turn up in northwest Georgia are my favorite Cottonmouths I've seen. And it's not very hard to understand why based on this photograph I've included, because these snakes can be so strikingly dark. But currently we only have the northern Cottonmouth and the Florida Cottonmouth, which is this guy here. And I think Florida Cottonmouths are pretty similar to the eastern Cottonmouth, but they do tend to be darker. They kind of almost look like an intermediate between the eastern and the western Cottonmouth. But currently Florida Cottonmouths are recognized as a full species, Echistrodon conanthi. And this is a big individual from southern Georgia. Next up, we have the Copperheads. I've included two different Copperheads for this tier list. We've got the southern Copperhead and the northern Copperhead, which you only really see in the Blue Ridge. I think the northern Copperhead is a little bit cooler. I would put these guys up here with the Cottonmouth. These guys look so different from the Copperheads you see in the rest of the state. And once again, this did used to be recognized as a separate subspecies, so I've included it as the northern Copperhead. And then we have the traditional southern Copperhead, which I would say this is a C-tier snake. These guys are one of the more common snakes you see on the roads pretty much anywhere in Georgia. And they're always a solid find, but I think they belong here with the rest of the solid find snakes. None of these snakes are really going to make your day, but they're always a welcome addition to the tally. Next up, we get into the rattlesnakes. So the eastern diamondback is probably, I would say, what most people would consider the best rattlesnake in Georgia. And I don't personally agree with that, but you can't put them any lower than A tier. Even if they're not my favorite rattlesnake we have here in the state, it would definitely be just nothing short of disrespectful to put them anywhere but A tier. Next up, we have the timber rattlesnake, which I've divided into a montane phase and a coastal plain phase. This is definitely a snake that's going to climb quite high on this list because not only are they special in my mind, but I think they're pretty universally loved. You can't put these snakes any lower than B tier. And personally, I would put the canebrake at A and the montane timber at B, even though I would say that these two forms are pretty close in my opinion. Something about the phenotypes you get with this beautiful stark white kind of silvery coloration with the orange stripe that I like more than this kind of dark contrasty. So this is mostly aesthetic. I think both of these snakes have a very interesting life history, and together, timber rattlesnakes are my favorite large-bodied rattlesnake in the state. I do like them more than diamondbacks myself, and both of these forms are relatively easy to find. That being said, there are places in the mountains where you can go see double digits of timbers in the state of Georgia, and I don't know of anywhere where you can go see double-digit canebrakes. Historically, they would have been considered a different subspecies. The canebrakes would have been considered Crotalus horridus atricaudatus. But the current taxonomy only recognizes one species, the timber rattlesnake. But yeah, both very good snakes. I think they could probably both go into A tier pretty easily, but we're trying to be a little bit more restrictive with A tier in this list. So we're just going to put the canebrake in A and timber in B. Next up, we have the pygmy rattlesnakes, which are some of my favorites. I think the dusky pygmy is definitely the less interesting of the two, but I think it'd be hard to put them anywhere lower than B tier. They're incredibly cool snakes, albeit a lot more common than the Carolina pygmy, which is our next pick. And these are another snake that anyone who watches this channel regularly knows it's going to be going quite high up. In fact, I made a mistake. I made a critical error somewhere right there and picked up the wrong snake. Yep, there we go. Carolina pygmy rattlesnakes are my favorite rattlesnake in the U.S. This picture speaks for itself. They are one of the most beautiful snakes we have in the state of Georgia, and while most people probably wouldn't put them in S, they get that special spot for me because they are just so special in my opinion. I've spent the better part of the last couple years of my life looking for these snakes and trying to get them figured out here in the state of Georgia. And over that amount of time, I've fallen head over heels in love with them. And I think they have very easily earned their spot in S tier, even if a lot of people aren't going to agree with that. Really awesome snakes. I think they're my favorite venomous snake in the state of Georgia. But with that being said, coral snakes. This is another snake that's very special to me. These are our only elapid in the state of Georgia, and I think I could probably put those guys in S tier. They're super unique. They're super special in the state of Georgia and in a couple of other states in the Southeast just because they can be so rare and they have such weird habits and such a weird distribution. These snakes live in the state of Georgia in a habitat unlike anything any other coral snake lives in. And to me, that's fascinating. To me, that blows my mind. You can find coral snakes in the state of Georgia living alongside wood frogs, which also live in the Arctic Circle. These kind of things where you get two species living alongside each other that typically you wouldn't think would, is one of the things that makes Georgia such an interesting state, and no snake better exemplifies that than the coral snake, in my opinion. So overall, we have the northern pine, the coach whip, the eastern king snake, Carolina pygmy, and the coral snake bringing up the top tier. And then we have the earth snakes bringing up the bottom tier. That being said, this is all for fun and all completely my opinion, so if you disagree, feel free to tell me where you would have put snakes that I put somewhere differently, and let me know why. Also, keep in mind this is only for the state of Georgia, and some of these snakes, if we were doing a different states tier list, would have different ranks. For example, the southern hognose snake is a lot rarer in Alabama than they are in Georgia, so if I was doing an Alabama tier list, we'd have to put this guy a lot higher. But yeah, I think that's going to be it. I think I have a pretty solid list here. And if I sit here and look at it for terribly long, I'll probably start second-guessing myself. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to wrap this video up here. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed. I know this is a little bit different. If you'd like to see me do a tier list for your state, let me know. And if you'd like to see me do some other kind of tier list that's herp-related, also let me know. Because I do like doing this. It's enjoyable. And I think it sparks interesting discussion. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you all in the next episode, where hopefully we will have an actual herping vlog, because the weather has been pretty brutal lately, but it gives me time to do things like this, which I've wanted to do for a while, so it's not a terrible thing.